Hello, my name is Jason Peck, and this is a Comedy Q&A interview with Professor David Konstan. In this interview, we talk about the Greek playwright Aristophanes, who's known as the father of comedy. We talk about the period after Aristophanes, which is known as Middle Comedy. And we also talk about the new comedy period of Greek playwright Menander. And we also discuss the Roman playwrights Plautus and Terence. If this is a subject that interests you, Professor Konstan is also the co-author of a book known as The Birth of Comedy. Check out the links below. And meanwhile, please enjoy the interview.
How are you?
I'm pretty good, pretty good.
Nice to see you.
Yes, indeed. So if it's okay, I'll just launch straight into things. Is that all right?
That'd be great.
Fantastic. Okay, so you co-authored a book called The Birth of Comedy, right?
Well, let me be more precise about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
The Birth of Comedy was a set of translations of fragments of ancient comedy, ancient Greek comedy specifically. So fragments. And I was one of the 5 contributors who translated some of the fragments for that volume. So that's exactly what that volume was. Indeed, Jeff Rustin was the primary editor, and he must be given full credit. He assembled all the materials, went over it, wrote all the introductions and that kind of thing. But I did, I think it was 5 or 6 different ancient comic poets whose works I translated.
Right.
So it's a 1-volume collection of all the major fragments. I might just explain briefly what a fragment is.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Fragment is something that is quoted in a later author, although we do not necessarily have the original work. So somebody whose works we do have happened to quote a line or 2 lines or even sometimes a longer passage from a piece of literature that otherwise is lost. And so we have 2 lines, 3 lines, just these bits and pieces. And what we struggle to do is put them together and try to make sense of them.
Got it.
The other source of fragments is papyri. And because they are sometimes damaged until we get a little piece, or else papyri very often were school texts. A person was copying out, or possibly for themselves, a piece of literature that they liked, an excerpt. And it survived, but we only have a little bit of it. So that's what we did in that book. Now, I just should add that I am the sole author of a book on Roman comedy and also one on Greek comedy. So, in fact, I have authored books, but not that one.
Got it. Okay, we'll get to those. That's great. So, if we're just thinking about these papyri, then is that the correct pronunciation?
Yes.
Okay. And the fragments that you have. What was roughly? Can you remember what the earliest one that you found that you were able to translate that was in the book?
Well, I think the earliest come from a character named Epicharmus, who was Sicilian. I make this point because Athenian comedy was rendered official on the Athenian stage in the middle of the 5th century BC. And from that point on, texts were prepared, they were read by an Athenian official, and they were selected for production. Then the state would provide actors and a chorus to mount these. So in Athens, which is where Aristophanes comes from and Menander comes from, excuse me, those are our texts. But we know that plays, sometimes called comedies, were produced elsewhere and maybe even in Athens, in rural towns, but earlier. And Epicharmus from Sicily, Aristotle says there was a kind of comedy produced in Megara, which is a nearby town to Athens, not very far away, subject of dispute and wars and so on. So there were earlier comedies, and we have some selections from them. Epicharmus tended to be philosophical in character, and he mocked philosophers.
Oh, okay. Nice. Got it. Okay. And so if we're thinking about Epicharmus and all those sort of earlier, the rough fragments, most of these are pre-Aristophanes, right?
Yes. Now, we do have Athenian playwrights who put their shows on in competition with Aristophanes and sometimes won, who were older than Aristophanes. The 2 most famous names are Cratinus, that's C, or in Greek it would be a K, Ratinus, and Crates, Crates. Those are the best known and the best preserved. Aristophanes was in direct competition with them, sometimes criticizing them explicitly,
Right.
and occasionally they wrote comedies, just as Aristophanes, made a farcical parody of Socrates.
Yeah.
He could do it of his rivals as well, calling them drunken old sots and things of that sort, which
Right.
he did and which they did in turn. So they were good at this. I'm sure it was good humored. A little bit like Saturday Night Live, people attacking each other. But
Yeah.
it was, but yes, they were elder comic writers. Aristophanes, when it comes to new comedy, old comedy, which is what
Yes.
he's associated with, he was one of the younger ones.
Got
But
it.
it just
Okay.
happens that we have 11 full plays of his, and we don't have any complete plays of the others. That's where the fragments come in. If you want to read Cratinus and Crates, at least any major, substantial, anything more than
Yeah.
one word, you will find the translation in that Birth of Comedy. So you just open
Got
the
it.
book, and there they are under their names.
Nice.
And so you can find, and with full attribution. So they tell you not just what the name of the comic poet is and what he wrote, but where we get it from, who quoted it, because that might tell you something about its context and what it might have meant to the original audience. So we provided a lot of material in that. It's a big fat volume for the price. It's well worth it.
Right. Got it. So,
Plug. Jeff Rustin.
Yeah, that's perfect.
He did a great job.
So if we're just thinking about a lot of those fragments of what we have and what's been translated, were there a lot of similarities in the style? Are they similar to Aristophanes, or were they as diverse as modern comedians and writers today?
They were probably not as diverse as they would be today, but they were diverse. So,
Okay.
for example, we know from the fragments and from descriptions that they were comedies that were based entirely on mythological themes. So
Okay.
they were mythological travesties. Now, Aristophanes may have written a couple of those. We don't know. He wrote 90-some plays. We only have 11. We don't have testimonies for absolutely all of them. But the plays we do have
Yes.
are all none of them has a strictly mythological theme. Gods appear in them,
Okay.
and there are some pretty wild plots, like the birds taking over in place of the gods and becoming the new rulers of the universe, but they're not strictly parodies of mythological themes, in which case they would have looked a little bit more like tragedies, but comic versions of tragedies, because tragedies did take myths.
Right.
So that's one example. And there may have been other kinds of more narrative plays. Aristophanes had a particularly wild style of comedy. But broadly speaking, I think it's safe to say that the tone and the immediate political satire in which Aristophanes engaged was probably characteristic of most of these comedies that were put on stage in Athens in the 5th century. This is the 5th century we're talking about when we're talking about old comedy.
Got it. Okay. So they would have essentially adhered to the Athenian structure, the Parabasis or Parabis.
Parabasis.
Sorry. Yes.
Yes,
and so
well,
on.
no,
Right?
they might not have.
Okay.
I see what you mean now.
Yeah.
The Parabasis, where one of the characters in the play basically sheds his character role and comes in and speaks straightforwardly in the persona of the author.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe sometimes maintaining his own persona, but speaking directly. This was not. It's not even true of all of Aristophanes' plays. He has a couple that lack the parabasis, and it's certainly possible, even likely, that other comic plays didn't use that technique.
Right.
It may be something that Aristophanes himself favored. It's hard to tell because if you don't have quotations that you can clearly identify as such. But my guess would be that this was optional.
Okay.
As were some other features of the internal comedy.
Right.
But they would all have a chorus.
Okay.
Every one of them would have a state-sponsored chorus which would dress up in one or another fashion. It could be human characters, as in Aristophanes' Acarnians. It could be strange creatures like people dressed as wasps in his play called The Wasp.
Yeah.
People dressed as clouds in his play called The Clouds.
Mm-hmm.
People dressed as birds in his play called The Birds, where he seems to have had a large chorus, and each one differently dressed. That's unusual, but each bird was identified by its own characteristics as it walked on stage.
Yeah.
And this was provided by the regime, by the archon or the ruler, and so the state paid for the training of the chorus.
Oh, wow.
And this was a big business. A chorus would have about, depends, it's a large, it's hard to say, 12 or 15 people in it. And they were citizens. They were not trained actors or slaves, for example. They were citizens for whom it was an honor to perform. But you had to train them. They had to sing together, had to dance together, and use very complex steps. And we even have an ancient speech about a young man who died while he was being trained at a rich man's house to put on, not a comedy in this case, but another kind of show. Yeah. And there was a big trial over it, because how did he get poisoned? Did he drink the wrong thing? There was an accident. So we do know that the training process was serious. You wanted to get that chorus up there, and you wanted to win. You dressed them up. A rich citizen would dress up the chorus, put on their. He wouldn't pay for the chorus itself, but he would dress them. That was one of the possible duties. It was like a kind of a tax. Yeah. And one guy is said to have dressed the chorus in order to win the contest in gold, to the extent that he ruined his entire fortune dressing up one chorus.
Wow.
These are big events.
Wow. Yeah.
The Super Bowl in America is something close, but wouldn't have quite the same. It's getting there. You're in that ballpark.
Right. Got it. Because it's really difficult to get that, for me at least, reading around the subject. I've got the Theatre of Aristophanes, I think it's by Kenneth MacLeish. I'm not certain. And it's really difficult for me at least to be able to pick up those, what it was really like. Because I didn't know, for example, that the chorus was state sponsored and they were regular people. And I certainly didn't conceive of the fact that it would have been as large as, America's Super Bowl.
Well, it wouldn't be, of course, America's Super Bowl is watched on television, but the number of people will see. It's very hard to say. There's big debates about the size of the theater in Athens at that time and how many it could hold. Some want to reduce it to as few as 7,000. Others want to make it as high as 25,000. If it was 25,000, and certainly later, maybe at the end of Aristophanes' life, it was amplified to that size, you're talking about a very substantial portion of the population, probably in percentage larger than the number of people who watch the Super Bowl on TV.
Wow.
And that's a lot of people. Yeah. But I don't think it quite gets to 50% of the American citizen body. Right. And it might have come close in ancient Athens. In fact, there are scholars who measure the population of cities by the size of the theater.
Wow. Okay, that's
because that will give you an idea of how big it was. You do a simple calculation, and these theaters are everywhere.
Yeah,
they're all the Greek cities, especially after the end of the 5th century and the beginning of the 4th. They're everywhere. Yeah, I compared the role of the theater a little later to the role of movies in spreading Athenian values and the spread. Just the American movies. And the spread of Hollywood through all of Europe and Asia and other parts is a very close similarity.
Yeah.
But I'm getting ahead of myself because the types of plays I'm talking about belong to new comedy and Menander and less to old comedy for a reason I can tell you, but we can go into that later.
Okay. So just to keep going from where I've got, so after Aristophanes, and he wrote in the period old comedy.
Old comedy, right?
There's what's known as, from what I've researched, middle comedy. That's the middle comedy period that came after, right?
Yeah.
Could you just tell me a little bit about the differences between old comedy and middle comedy?
Well, I can tell you, but only a little, and there's a good reason why. We don't have a single surviving example of middle comedy, at least not in Greek. We have copies of them, editions, translations of them into Latin.
Okay.
when Plautus and Terence were writing. So we don't know very much about it. In addition, we don't even know whether it is really a worthwhile distinction. It is made. Where do we get these terms? Old comedy, new comedy, and middle comedy. We get them from ancient texts that wrote about comedy. And you can read those in Jeff Rustin's book on the birth of comedy, because he translated those too.
Wow.
So that when you can see where we get our terminology. But middle comedy is restricted to one or two of these little treatises on comedy.
Yeah.
What it is something that lies between Menander's new comedy and old comedy, and what might have been of his features. It looks as though they may have had more emphasis on the role of what we term today courtesans. That is, high-class call girls who would rent out their services. It may be that the figure of the parasite, that is, the character who is constantly scrounging for a meal and therefore goes around flattering rich people, that may have been another element added to comedy at this time. Comedy was undergoing some kinds of transitions because, at least when you read a play by Aristophanes and you read one by Menander, it's very easy to see how different they are.
Right.
Very different. So between old and new, there's a sharp difference. So middle might have been a transitional phase.
Okay.
The only problem with being too secure about this is that if we had more old comedy and more new comedy, maybe there would be some more continuity that we can't judge. But since Menander is the chief poet of new comedy, Aristophanes was the chief poet of old.
Yeah.
When we look at their works, we can make a pretty clear, sharp contrast. And middle comedy is anything that we assume in the period between Aristophanes died around 388 BC. Menander's first comedy was produced around 323. So he got a 50-year, maybe less, 40-year break. And in that interval, we situate middle comedy, but we don't really know what it was like.
Got it. Okay. Do we have any fragments from this period?
Yeah, we do. Oh, yes,
okay.
Yes. Different poets, sure, that seem to have been older than Menander. But the main fragments come from Menander, his contemporaries, and slightly later.
Got it. Okay. So
Menander's fragments are huge. We have many, many fragments.
Okay. Well, I've got I brought a little show and tell with me for this conversation. I picked up this a number of years ago. This is Aristophanes and Menander New Comedy. In here, we've
can I see the author who wrote it?
Yeah.
Let's see.
That's Kenneth McLeish and J. Michael Walton.
Oh, yeah. So those are translations, right?
Yeah.
Kenneth McLeish. Yeah. Got it.
And in here, I've got Aristophanes' last two, which is Women in Power, which is also known as Assembly Women, right?
That's right.
And Wealth. And I've got two from Menander, The Malcontent and The Woman from Samos.
Right.
Do we have? I mean, this is all I have.
Well, there's plenty more around.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me tell you, the two plays selected from Aristophanes are his two last plays that survive.
Right.
The last one was actually produced in 388 by his son. So Aristophanes is already dead. The previous one, that's The Wealth. The previous one, The Women in Power, or The Assembly Women, where women take power in the state.
Yeah.
It's voted to them by the men, but they then take power and they create a whole communist society. That's 391. So these are 4th century plays, late plays of Aristophanes that people see as differing from Aristophanes' earlier works. And they mark a kind of transition to new comedy.
Okay.
The two plays selected by Menander are The Grouch or The Misanthrope. That one is the only play of Greek new comedy that survives complete. And it was discovered on papyrus in 1959.
Wow.
So we're not talking about something that old. If you read anything before then, no one had a complete play. The Woman from Samos was also recovered from papyrus in considerable fragments in 1895, but more fragments were found, and it's It's not complete, but it's complete enough to give you a very good idea of how it works. I can't recall exactly what percentage of it we probably have, maybe 2/3 or something like that. So we don't have a complete version of any other play, but that's a good choice. So what the translators have done, we have of Menander maybe 4 other plays, 3 or 4 others besides those 2. 3 in particular that we survive sufficiently complete that we can reconstruct the plot quite well. But the Grouch, or the what do they call it there? The
malcontent.
The malcontent. That's the only one that we really have, with a couple of words missing here and there, but that's the one that we have complete on a papyrus. That was a really extraordinary discovery. So now we can read that. So that's what you've done. You've got a small selection, but it's the translators and editors have tried to match the late plays of Aristophanes, which are marking this transition to maybe middle comedy, if you wanted to call it that, and then Menander's plays. We don't have any other complete or even nearly complete plays by any other ancient comic playwright. So there was a natural choice.
Got it. Okay. So because we don't have as much of Menander's work, I mean, obviously, I'm talking from my perspective. I don't feel that he gets talked about as much as, say, Aristophanes does.
Well, no, it varies. The reason is that, and here I'll go back to something I said I would postpone for a moment earlier on. Aristophanes' comedies are what we call topical. That is to say, they deal with the current political situation. So you have a parody of Aristophanes, or you have a plays about the war going on between Athens and its allies, and Sparta and its allies. And they go ask for peace, and you bring the Athenians and the Spartans on stage, and they do a dance together, and they perform, and they make various kinds of coarse jokes and coarse remarks. So these are plays that are very locally situated. They're about Athens. They're about Athens' problems. Now, if you want to put on a general play about war and peace and show how the opposition, I've seen Aristophanes' Lysistrata, where a woman staged a sex strike, but also the women occupy the Acropolis where the treasury is in an effort to stop the war. And I've seen this put on with the Spartans looking like Russians and the Athenians looking like Americans. I've seen it put on in various other forms where you update it to some current conflict. And you offer a solution in terms of women. But in order to do that, you really have to change it pretty radically, because many things are going to be relevant to that particular time, which don't really make sense when they're translated into another language. So you need a lot of footnotes to make sense of it. You need a lot of and they're always there. They're always explaining the jokes. Either that, or you have to really turn the joke around and make it, instead of a joke about Pericles, you make it a joke about Trump or Obama. But that's all very well, but then you don't feel you're really in the same world. You feel you've got a modern comedy. With new comedy, the plots are completely different. They are not political in the same way. They may have some political meaning, but they are going to be the ancestors of contemporary sitcoms, where there are romantic stories, characters fall in love, they have obstacles, a father protests. In the case of the Grouch, that play, it's an old misanthropic guy who has a daughter. A young rich character falls in love with her. The misanthrope is such a nasty fellow, he doesn't want to marry his daughter off to anyone. So you get various things. What happens? The guy falls in a well, and he's helped. And he realizes, well, I really do need help after all. I can't be entirely on my own. So, okay, I'll give my daughter. Actually, he lets his stepson give the daughter away in marriage, and the play ends happily. Now, that's a play that you don't need to have a lot of footnotes for. You can have them. You can say, well, yes, Athenians were poor farmers in this case, and many of them might have been grouchy like this guy, and many of them misanthropes. You could give contemporary references to misanthropic literature. But the basic story about somebody falling in love, there's a grouchy old father who won't let his daughter marry. You don't need a lot of footnotes for that. And when the Romans decided to translate these plays into Latin for the Roman stage,
Yeah.
Aristophanes didn't travel, but Menander's comedies did.
Got
And
it.
so what we do is we know a lot about Menander's comedies, but in Latin translation. So Terence died young. He wrote 6 comedies, very, very influential, enormously influential comedies. 4 of them are based on Menander, directly on Menander.
Right.
Now, he made changes. And, of course,
Okay.
they're in Latin. They're not in Greek.
Yeah.
There are various other kinds of changes. He sometimes took pieces from 2 different plays and combined them. But you get a pretty good idea of what Menander wrote like. And also we have a commentary in Latin that tells us, with 5 out of the 6 plays, a little bit about what Terence actually did, because these guys still had the Greek. So we know much more. Plautus is the other one whose work survived.
Yeah.
So if you want to know about Menander up until recently, you have to look at Plautus and Terence. But
Got it.
they're telling you a lot about what he wrote like.
Nice. Got it. And so you were saying that that Menander's work, and also leading on to Plautus and Terence, they're very similar to what we know as modern sitcoms today, you think?
They look, yes,
Right.
they do. That's right. The answer to that one is yes. There are differences,
Yeah,
and I
of course.
can explain them, but their bigger situation is different. You don't have slaves today.
Yes.
At least they're not called slaves. I'm joking, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
You got the poor.
Mm-hmm.
But we can recognize the types. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. And just before we move on to the Roman playwrights, just lastly about Menander. From what we know of his surviving works, are there any modern comedians or modern comedy writers or movies that you feel sort of, have that flavor, or would you say, because they're very similar to modern sitcoms today, it's quite a broad range, that a lot of them have that flavor of what Menander might have been like? I'm asking because I'm just trying to paint a picture for people either watching this or listening to this who are, so they can try to engage, go, oh, okay, so he's a bit like this guy or this show.
If you wanted a teacher of mine once said he was comparing Charlie Chaplin with the Marx Brothers.
Okay.
Groucho.
Yeah.
And he said, Groucho Marx is more intellectual comedy. I said, what? It's absurd. It's farce. It's ridiculous. Charlie Chaplin is much more realistic. He shows sentimental stories, a blind girl and a love with a man, all these sweet stories. Yeah, sometimes he was political, but he was. But many of his comedies are just these more realistic, naturalistic kinds of plots. He said, yes, but that's the point. They're appealing to your emotions. The Marx Brothers, it's all verbal wit. Right. They're making puns. They're making silly jokes. If a spy is on trial and they say, do you have the code? He says, yes, I have a code and 2 pairs of plans. He used to say a coat and 2 pairs of pants.
Yes.
Now that's an intellectual joke. You've got to capture it. It breaks the frame. So in that respect, the Marx Brothers, with their farcical intellectual humor, are much more like old comedy and Aristophanes. Right. And Charlie Chaplin, with his romantic, sentimental plots, is much more like Menander.
Got it. Okay.
And there's the difference, and I think it works. Okay. My teacher's name was Moses Hattis. I give him credit.
Nice. So I've got more show and tell.
Okay.
I've got Plautus. This is The Pot of Gold and Other Plays. This is translated by E.F. Watling. And I've got the Pseudolus, if that's the correct pronunciation of that.
Yes, it is.
This has The Pot of Gold and The Prisoners in it. Oh, and the brothers Menechmus and the
Menechmus, or Menechmus, yeah.
And the Swaggering Soldier. That's
good selection. 5 plays, right?
And
we've got 20 by Plautus, so that's a good selection.
Oh, okay, that's great. So there's more I could get.
Yeah.
And I've got this one by Terence. This is translated by Betty Radice. And I've got The Girl from Andros here, The Self-Tormentor, The Eunuch, Phormio, and the mother-in-law. Oh, and the brothers.
Yeah, that's all 6.
Oh, that's all.
That's all we have.
Okay, got it. So now chronologically, Plautus is earlier, right?
Yes, right.
Right. And so you were saying that they pretty much both of them a lot of them translated and then combined some of Menander's work.
Yeah, they adapted, Menander and other playwrights of Menander's time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So did they...
Not just some of them, all of them.
All of them. Okay.
As far as we know, all of them were based on Greek models. Some people contend that 1 or 2 of Plautus's plays may have been independent. In Terence's case, absolutely. But very often Plautus, in the prologue, tells you exactly whose play and which precise play he was adapting.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It tells you, because right on there and says, this is the one that was being adapted.
Right.
So we know.
So now, it's a little bit of a confession, I suppose. Because what I always feel, because I knew that about Plautus and Terence, I've often felt that they were, they didn't really contribute much. Now, I'm more than open to be corrected here, but I've often felt that they didn't really contribute or advance comedy as much as say Aristophanes and Menander did before them, and because they were just doing a lot of translations or adaptations of a lot of the new playwrights. So is that a fair assessment? Were they able to advance comedy?
I would say that not entirely. What I mean by that is it's one thing when you're translating plays like these in these little editions that you have, and you want to give the reader a sense of what the original play was like. That's your objective.
Right.
You're going to use it in a classroom. You're going to say, this is a classroom on ancient comedy.
Yeah.
You may hope that somebody will put your translation on stage someday, and you may hope that they will do it well. But your objective is to reach a reading public.
Okay.
When Plautus and Terence were putting their plays on, that was not their concern. They had a script. They did not have a text of a translation. They were distributing it among their actors whom they were training, and if they weren't going to be good, they were going to be booed off stage, or simply the audience would leave. We have one of the plays, The Mother-in-Law, by Terence, in which we are told in a prologue that comes out on stage and tells us that this is the 3rd time Terence is putting the play on, because the previous 2 times the audience left. One time to see a tightrope walker, which was playing next door. These are in a circus-type environment.
Right,
They're one of the attractions. Now, not in every case. Sometimes they were produced for other purposes. But they were one of the attractions going on. You either kept your audience's attention or you didn't. And you don't do this by rendering a translation faithfully and making sure that every word corresponds to what the original said. No, you do it by turning it into a play that's lively, making it as much up to date as you can, and relevant to your audience.
Yeah.
And this is what Plautus did. So take one example.
Hi there, Jason Peck here. Just interrupting to let you know that unfortunately we lost the video portion of this interview, and I'm really sorry about that. But we do have the audio portion, so I hope you are able to complete the rest of this interview audio only. Thanks very much for your understanding.
Plautus added musical numbers to these plays, which were not the original. So you look at the meters, and you're right there. All of a sudden, somebody's out there singing an aria. And he's translating a play of Menander, and we know that Menander had no such arias in his work.
Yeah.
Now, Menander did have something else. He had a chorus, but we don't know what the chorus said, as we do with tragedy or with Aristophanes. Why? Because all you have is, in the manuscript, in the papyrus, you have a break, and it says chorus. So evidently, some people came on stage. Sometimes they were revelers, sometimes they were drinkers, and they probably did a song and dance, but it's like an intermission. It's like halftime. it was not a formally scripted thing. Maybe sometimes they give him an idea of what to do. He probably trained them, but it was not part of the plot. So you read the plot. In the Roman adaptations, they left that bit for the chorus out entirely. And so what did Plautus substitute? Song and dance smack in the middle of the play. So some character all of a sudden breaks into singing.
Yeah.
So you've got a musical comedy now, which was not the case in Greek.
Huh.
Simply, now that's a big difference.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
And we only know, we can't hear them sing, but we can see from the meter what the music was like. And people today, where there's much more interest in trying to recover performance values and not just text, are looking carefully to see what you can deduce from that about the music and about how it was performed. And the answer is quite a lot. It can change the picture about what those comedies were like if you realize what was going on stage.
Yeah.
And there were all sorts of other things that the Roman plays, for example, really emphasized the role of the clever slave who masterminds the plot. Now, if we had all of Greek comedy, maybe we would find that there were more clever slaves than we think. But it's pretty clear that this is one of the features that Plautus really liked. The uppity, clever slave who's completely unafraid, even if you threaten to beat him, burn him, stab him, he just more backtalk.
Right.
And it's very unlikely that the Greeks were doing this, but maybe some of them were. In any case, the Roman plays are inventive, new adaptations. Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors is based on Plautus's Menander, exactly what it's based on.
Yes.
But Shakespeare doubled up all the characters. He made everything more complicated. He is explicitly and clearly based on the ancient play, no question about it, but it's different. Moliere's Miser is based very closely on the Pot of Gold.
Okay.
And the Pot of Gold has a miser who looks like the misanthrope in the Menander play, but it's a different kind of thing. He's a miser instead of a misanthrope, but a similar type of thing. He won't let his daughter marry because he's too miserly to give her a dowry. All that stuff. Everything works out the same way. Yet Moliere's play is completely different in many, many respects. And so when you think about a movie today that looks back to a Comedy of Errors, like this musical, The Boys from Syracuse.
Yes.
That's based on Shakespeare going back to Plautus.
Right.
But it's a musical comedy. As a musical comedy, it's very much like Plautus and very different from what Menander would have done.
Right.
So there you go.
Great. So, and I feel that clever, I can't really think of a modern comparison now, but that clever slave archetype, it certainly existed at least into the 20th century, right? That the lower class character.
The Fawns on Happy Days. I'll give you one. The Fawns on Happy Days. Yeah. He's Italian. He's a little bit older, very similar to the Formio that you have there in Terence, by Terence. Very similar type of character. He's older. He's helpful. He helps the young, innocent, naive chaps out of trouble. He's a loner. But sophisticated. He has got more experience of life. That's a character right out of ancient comedy.
Nice. Okay.
Adapted instead of being a slave or a down and out type. He's a slightly oddball figure. He doesn't seem to have a family. He's detached from the social environment. He's more manipulative of the social conventions. Right. Just what you have in comedy.
Right, and he sort of comes in. So you've got the family unit. He sort of comes in, does what he does, advances the plot, and then leaves.
Yes, or he stays. But if he does, he is he's that outsider who helps out. And this is very often what the slave did. The alternative would be, the younger Family Matters, Steve Urkel. Who's always getting everything wrong, but somehow also solving things. So he's the character who is a little bit absurd and out of touch. These obviously they're not going to be. But you can get if you don't have slaves, you can have servants. In British comedy, you very often have. Well, think of P.G. Wodehouse with his Jeeves. You know, the servant who really knows how to make things work.
Yeah.
Of course, he's not a slave, but he's dependent on the primary family.
Right.
Oh, yeah, you can have him work.
Right. But
slavery is extremely important to Roman comedy. There's a very recent book on comedy by Amy Richlin, Richlin, very recent, just came out on, God, if I can remember what it was, but it's on Plautus and slavery. It's precisely on that, and just how important. It's a big fat book, but very readable. She's smart, she's funny, she's full of feeling and passion as well, and so she tells you a lot about how important slaves are and why they're important in the Roman context. In the Greek context, they're there everywhere. This is a world of slaves.
Right.
Amy is completely right. You can never forget that when about anything with you're reading about ancient literature. It's a world full of slaves.
Yeah. And so then you were saying that Plautus is very similar to, essentially began like musical comedy, would you?
Mm-hmm.
And so then how different was, and he was the early playwright, how different was Terence's comedies when he came along?
Terence has reduced drastically the number of musical arias. He seems to like to have a style closer to Menander. He has fewer. He doesn't put in a lot of, for example, one of the things that Plautus does is a lot of invented words that he just makes up for the comic purpose. In this respect, he's like Aristophanes.
Right.
In this respect, he's just like Aristophanes. And he knew Greek. They all knew Greek very well. He came from South Italy where there were Greeks. He in his epitaph that says he was a man of three hearts. He knew, or minds. He knew Greek. He knew his native language, which was in Italy, and he knew Latin. So Terence eliminates that verbal dexterity, that verbal pyrotechnics, and he sticks more closely to the naturalistic plain style of Menander. He was thought to be a model of style. And people copied his plays in part because they were stylistically so pure.
Yeah.
He didn't have quite some people think the comic, I think Julius Caesar was supposed to have said he didn't have the comic force or power of Menander, but it was a more civilized poet in that respect.
Right.
He himself, by the way, had been a slave, had been taken from North Africa, probably Berber at that time, rather than sub-Saharan black. Oops, I'm going to just make sure I don't answer the phone. Hold on a second. It's my wife calling, so I'll ring her later instead of answering.
Hello, please leave a message.
Maybe I should. No.
Hola, David. Te llamo para decirte que estoy bien, que llegué bien a clase y que aparté muy bien y no he tenido ningún problema. Así que mejor, no tienes que volver a buscarme ni conquistamos tu día con Michael y con toda la pesca. Porque sería a las 4, tengo citas casi hasta las 4, creo. Pero bueno, ya cuando acabe aquí, bueno, no sé exactamente cuándo terminaré. Creo que tengo citas, las tengo que mirar de nuevo a las 4 o así. Y la clase, bien, estaba muy impresionado porque les he explicado, como en la antología no había sanitizado mucho a imponerse, les recogí los textos, una serie de textos donde pues, y les di el artículo de Pablo Visova que está hecho por Ian Brenner y es muy bueno, muy claro y tiene citas.
The message is in Spanish.
Es bastante reciente, para que vean, no habían oído hablar de fármacos de este ritual ni de nada. Así que les ha gustado, creo. Bueno, un beso y luego lo veo.
That's my wife is from Spain, and so she leaves a long message. You don't need to put this on the recording, but you can have it if you like.
I'll cut this bit out for you.
Okay.
We were just talking about Terence being a model of style. That was the last thing I remember us talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was a model of style for later writers who's frequently described like that by Romans themselves. So, for example, I mentioned that we have a commentary dating from about the 4th century AD on Terence's plays. So why would you write a commentary explaining the vocabulary because it's a few centuries old, explaining the plots, telling you how he did or didn't adapt Menander? You have it because schoolboys are reading it. And they need information. Yeah. All the ancient commentaries, or virtually all of them, are for school purposes. They're for instruction, a little bit like translations today. And so so we know that he was taught to students, and when later comic writers, Cicero and others, quote drama, they very often quote Terence.
Right.
And some of his sentences are still popular today, little phrases that he made. Whereas Plautus seems a little bit too wild, too exaggerated, and nobody was going to use him as a model for how to write.
Right. Okay. So, sorry, just to be clear, you were saying that even back then they would have, the pupils in school would have been studying these texts?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So essentially they would have been like almost fresh off the stage, and they were, Well,
probably, I don't mean immediately after Terence's life, although, but within a century. I mean, these things are odd because comedy in Greece and in Rome had a long history, but not that long. You have from Plautus is about the earliest, and Terence is not the latest. It goes on another half a century. And then original comic works in this style for the stage start to fade out, and you get a different kind of comic production. These are the comic productions that are called mimes. They're not pantomimes, they're mimes. Mimes are farcical plays, parodies, sometimes on mythical themes. Sometimes there was a famous type called the adultery mime, where the hapless husband is cheated on by his wife. They're funny stories. They could put on even classical plays this way. Even pantomimes were common. They largely took over the theater instead of these comedies that the types we know. It's one of those changes that just occurs. People stop writing one kind of genre and they stop writing another. Popularity changes. Today, what could we give as an example? Well, nobody writes epic today, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a tragedy put on stage. You find sad plays, melodramas, but who's writing something like Oedipus for the movies? So these things have philosophical dialogues is another example. You've got Plato, you've got others, but today to write a philosophical dialogue seems kind of quaint and out of date. So this is what happened to ancient comedy, and when it did, these things ceased to be performed as frequently and started turning into things you read. And so schoolboys in, let's say, Christian times would have been reading Terence the way we read Terence when we teach people Latin. And by the way, we have medieval plays based on Terence too.
Right. Are we talking about the mystery plays?
No, not precisely the mystery plays, but there was a nun named Hrotswitha, who, it's a funny name, Hrotsswitha, Hrotswitha, who adapted to very Christian purposes, very Christian, something of Terence's style. And she wrote 6 plays, just the type the number we have from Terence, to show the connection. Now, they're not adaptations of Terence's plays at all. They're entirely Christian. But his popularity remained through the medieval period. He wasn't completely lost, whereas she would probably have found very little to pay homage to in Plautus.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And just briefly, you were saying that Terence was likely originally a slave from North Africa?
Yeah.
And then
brought over probably in the Punic Wars and the wars with Carthage.
Right.
And then he was trained and educated in a wealthy household, took over his cognomen. The Romans often have 3 names.
Okay.
His middle name is Terentius. for Terence, and
Yeah.
that's a name he took from a Roman family. But his final name is Afer, A-F-E-R, which just means the African.
Oh, wow.
But Africa in Roman times,
Yeah.
referred to what's today Tunisia.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it didn't refer to the whole continent.
Yeah.
I mean, it could, but it didn't. Typically, it referred. So we know that he would have been brought over, presumably probably when Hannibal was defeated, and he was brought over as a slave. He was trained. His abilities and education were recognized. He was doubtless freed, and he was reputed to have very good contacts with some of the leading aristocratic families in Rome,
Oh, wow.
the Scipios in particular. To the extent that there was an accusation that the leading Scipio, Africanus, the one who defeated and others, and his offspring, were actually the authors of Terence's plays.
Oh.
And he rejected this indignantly. I was the author, and Scipio had nothing to do with it.
So much like, people call into question Shakespeare's authorship today.
Yeah, probably, except this was done by his contemporaries and as a deliberate slander. Got
it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And earlier on, you were talking about that right at the beginning. I think we were discussing that you, aside from the Birth of Comedy book, you had written your own book, sole authorship of Roman comedies, right? Roman and Greek. And what books?
Well, one book is just called Roman Comedy.
Roman Comedy. Okay.
And the other book is called Greek Comedy and Ideology.
Greek Comedy and Ideology.
Yeah, those are the two books I've written on ancient comedy.
Great. And they're just textbooks about that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, each one analyzes particular plays.
Oh, okay. I've got one final question I wanted to ask you.
Sure.
The question is, and it's a question that I'm trying to ask as many people as I can that I speak to, and obviously I adapt it a little bit. But knowing what we know about the Greek comedy Menander and the Roman comedies, the Roman playwrights, is there any lessons that you wish that modern comedies or modern comedians would learn from their work beyond just doing adaptations? Is there something when you watch them and you go, "Oh, I wish they would do something like this to take it on a level"? Or
well, let's see. It's a good question, and I want to think if there were. I don't think so. I think, but what I mean by that is that I think the lessons from ancient comedy have been learned, and they are already manifest on the stage. When you see something like Saturday Night Live and its parodies, they love doing Trump and so on. You're talking about the same type of thing that Aristophanes was doing when he ridiculed, for example, the very popular leader Cleon, to the extent that Cleon took him to court.
Right.
And tried to, and laws, we're told laws were passed criticizing, or prohibiting rather, naming people, real people, by name and putting on their caricatures on stage. So, yes, Aristophanes' plays were longer than a skit on Saturday Night Live. We don't quite have whole movies of that farcical kind, partly because the subject matter will change.
Yeah.
So if you're imitating Trump today and he's not president, and 10 years from now nobody's going to remember who he was. Aristophanes didn't care about that because in classical times a play was put on only once.
Right.
So it's there, it's for the occasion, that's that. Nobody cares at Saturday Night Live. You go tell a 20-year-old young person to look at Saturday Night Live shows from 1970s or 80s.
Yeah.
They're not going to catch the references. They're not going to catch the allusions. They have to read. They need a commentary. And so it's not funny anymore. So they're not planning it forever. And neither was Aristophanes.
Right.
Neither were the tragedians. Neither was anybody. They were all doing it just for that moment. It could be put on by little groups, just the way today you can put on a skit in a high school play, but it was not the same thing. So, when it comes to the sitcom type of work, it's very similar. And Hollywood romantic movies, It Happened One Night and things of that sort. All these great movies that people loved. This is they are paying tribute already, consciously or unconsciously. So when you see a funny thing happen on the way to the Forum, which is built from the Braggart Soldier, it's based directly on that, with music and singing, just the way Plautus did it. It's really good. But Larry Gelbart, one of the writers of that play, was also one of the writers for MASH on the sitcoms on television and so on.
Right.
So we're dealing with a world of intersecting patterns and themes by people who are fairly sophisticated and know their background. So, yes, I think the lessons have been absorbed.
Okay.
All I can say is people should read more of the ancient ones, and then they would and they would get new ideas. But basically, we know them.
Okay. Great. I did just want to ask you. This is not anything formal, but you mentioned a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. Did you ever see it was a BBC? It was a sitcom called Up Pompeii. Did you ever see that?
No, I'm afraid I haven't. I missed it.
Well, there are a couple of clips you can see on YouTube. Up Pompeii, it starred an English comedian. This is sort of 60s, 70s era, called Frankie Howard, and he was a slave. His character's name was Lurcio, and it was set in obviously ancient Greece, Pompeii, and before the Mount Vesuvius.
Ancient Italy.
Yes, before Mount Vesuvius exploded, and he would always, you'd have the story, whatever the story was, someone was trying to have a romantic interlude, but he'd always, because it was a live studio audience, he'd always talk directly to the audience that were there at the recording. And then he'd make references to the BBC and the contracts and what the time is. And as I watched that as a kid, but as I've watched it as I've got older, and I've got, a little bit of understanding about ancient Greek comedy, it seems that, perhaps that what they were recreating would have been similar to what some of the ancient Greek comedies would have been like.
Yes, it sounds like, especially Aristophanes, but a kind of a mixture of the two.
Yes.
May I ask where you're from originally?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm originally from the UK.
Which part?
Southern England, sort of.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Okay. I've lived there for bits and pieces myself, but in visiting scholar in Cambridge a couple of times, and in Edinburgh a couple of times.
Right, nice. Yeah, both very nice areas.
Well then, this has been a pleasure.
Absolutely.
Let me know just keep me apprised of what use you make of these. Not for any purposes of control, just curiosity and interest.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm not sure if I explained, but roughly what I'm planning to do is I'm going to have the raw versions of the interviews available for anyone who wants to see them. And then my original plan currently is to have, one podcast episode trimmed down where I would cut between different people that I've spoken to about a given subject. Okay. And then if people are interested in, hearing the longer interviews, for example, I interviewed a jester a few weeks ago, and so she was talking about her experience of being a jester, but also other sort of areas of interest that she had. So if people are interested in the longer interviews, those will be available as well.
Okay,
that's roughly
very good. I don't think I said anything embarrassing.
You didn't.
Well, nice to meet you, Jason.
You too, Professor. Thank you very much for your time.
You're very welcome. Have a good day.
You too. Thanks very much. Bye now.
Bye now.
This is the end of this interview. If you'd like to hear more interviews, please check out our website, comedyqna.com. That's the word comedy, the letter Q, the letter N, the letter A.com. Thanks very much for listening.